We are going to start off our Big Three with a couple of these Big Ten teams. Not a traditional Big Ten matchup, but number 2, Ohio State, heading up to Eugene, Oregon to play number 3, the Oregon Ducks. This will be at 6:30 p.m. on NBC. And man, let me tell you what, I am excited to watch this one. This has been a game that I have had circled all offseason as one of the premier games of the year, not just of this weekend slate. And both of these teams coming in playing pretty well, but maybe not quite as well as I had expected to see out of both of them. They're both winning games. They're both doing it at a fairly good clip. But the Ohio State offense may be a little bit slower out of the gate than I expected. Oregon, maybe not quite as sharp as I expected. Went real close with a good Boise State team, but probably a little too close. Kind of looking at this matchup, I want to kind of gauge where you are on this one to start. How do we think Ohio State fares in their first big road test? Obviously they went off to play Michigan State on the road. Not necessarily a big test for them, but going up to play at Oregon, it gets loud, it gets crazy. How do we think they do? How do we think they handle that pressure going into that game?
Well, this is just such a weird one, right? Because I think if you looked at the preseason line on this game, I think Oregon was a slight favorite. Certainly not insurmountably so. And I think if you parsed it out, it probably would have essentially been kind of a pick 'em if we were playing this game on a neutral field. But
Right.
that shifted over the last couple of weeks. And I think last I checked, it was Ohio State -3 now. And I think that's more of a function, not necessarily a comment on how Ohio State's played this year, but more so a comment on how Oregon's been. I think coming into the season, it seemed that Dylan Gabriel was just getting anointed as, well, this guy's going to be the Heisman frontrunner. He put up big numbers at Oklahoma. We saw what Bo Nix did in this offense last year. It certainly seems like a match made in heaven. And it's not necessarily that it's been a bad fit that I would say. It's just the offense has not been as explosive as it was this past year. You lose Troy Franklin to the NFL. You lose Bucky Irving to the NFL. You lose a couple of good guys on the offensive line to the NFL. And it seems like they've had a tougher time replacing those guys than I think any of us really envisioned. They bring in Evan Stewart out of the transfer portal, and it kind of seemed tailor-made for, all right, we're anointing Tez Johnson into this Troy Franklin number 1 role, and Evan Stewart's going to slide into the role that he played last year, and they're not going to miss a beat. And that's really not how it's played out this year. The passing game just not as explosive, a lot of dinking and dunking. On our podcast, Clinton's joked multiple times that Dylan Gabriel needs a Dunkin' Donuts NIL deal because he calls him just Dunkin' Dylan is what he's been calling him. I'm like, that seems a little harsh, but they don't throw the ball deep all that often. I think we were talking Oregon we're talking this game on our show on Monday night, and one of the guys we had on to help us preview Oregon made a point that they made a change at center a few games ago, and the offensive line seems to have been better since that change has been instituted. They're running the ball better. Jordan James is coming off his best game of the year. I think he had like 140 rushing yards in the first half against Michigan State. And I get it's Michigan State, so there's not really a whole lot that you can necessarily take out of that game, but they seem to be rounding into form at the right time. Their defensive line's been a lot better too. I think a lot of the rushing stats for Oregon are skewed by what Ashton Jeanty did to them, and that's probably not the fairest comparison, considering he's done that to everyone, and he's doing things that have not been seen in this sport in 35, 40 years.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like the no-duh comment. This game's going to be won in the trenches. Coming into the year for Ohio State, the questions were on the offensive line. They've been playing pretty well this year. Early in the year, they were a little banged up. Donovan Jackson seems healthy now, and they've been running the ball certainly well. They have a good 1-2 duo in the backfield, as good as there is in the country. Also strong on the defensive line. I think Ohio State 17 sacks on the season, Oregon 16. So they both get after the quarterback pretty well. They got a lot of talent, both teams in the front seven. It seems like that's going to be where this game is won and lost. Which of these front sevens, which of these offensive lines shows up and has the better game?
Yeah, I think you're probably going to end up being right on that one. It's a lot of times you look at these teams and it's all, kind of the passing. You see the quarterbacks, the receivers, and you try to look at these big time matchups and you just think, well, the guys are highly rated. And so, we expect them to play well. But that really, I don't think is probably going to end up being the case in this one. When I was looking at this game, obviously Ohio State comes in number one scoring defense. They're giving up 6.8 points per game. I know they really haven't played anybody, and Iowa certainly doesn't have a pulse on offense. And so take those numbers for what they are. There's a couple of those teams we'll talk about tonight. But I think when you look at this, the quarterback numbers are a little bit similar. But again, you were talking about it, a little bit of a different thing. I think more inconsistency from what I've seen out of Will Howard versus Dylan Gabriel. I love the Duncan Dillon, a little bit of a check down merchant for him, and just kind of getting his job done. The completion percentage is impressive, but I guess it's easy to hit a guy when he's just a couple yards upfield. For me, when I was looking at this, I love the run game from both sides. I think I'd go Ohio State's way when I'm looking run game. Right, you love Quinshon Judkins, you love Travion Henderson, and Jordan James is really coming into his own. For me, I think it's a freshness question, right? It's just going to be, you got two guys versus one guy. Jordan James can absolutely tote the rock, and I think he'll find some success in this game. But man, can he stay fresh enough? Can they give him 20, 25, push 30 carries? I don't think he can do that, and they still have success versus, I think you can kind of give Quinshon or Travion maybe 10 to 12 each. And you probably end up liking the way that they're running this thing even in the fourth. But I am curious about this. So you talked about the wide receiver position a little bit. Ohio State clearly has the edge, I think, at the wide receiver position. But I'm curious how much that affects, and obviously with the higher completion percentage for Gabriel, maybe less talent out there, though. Who do you think is going to make the bigger plays in this one from the quarterback spot, right? You got a couple guys new to the program starting to kind of, again, play this first big test of the season for both of them. I have a feeling this is going to come down to making some big time throws on third down, trying to move some chains, flip the field, make some chunk plays. Who do you think, if it comes down to that, is going to be able to make the bigger play?
Oh, that's a good question. We haven't really needed to see that from Will Howard yet. And, we're talking about two guys who, there hasn't been a ton of game pressure on them this year, but these are guys who at their last stops both played in big time moments. With Red River this week too, we've seen the Dylan Gabriel highlights from last year leading that nails drive to win the game at the end. But we're also talking about a Will Howard who beat number 3 TCU to win a Big 12 title a couple of years ago. He probably had his best game of the season in an overtime loss against Texas last year. So there are two guys who have done it before, even though it hasn't really been asked of them this year. I still have some questions about Will Howard's ability to be a difference maker in the pass game. So if I were to lean one over the other, I would probably lean Gabriel just because I've seen maybe a little bit more from him this year. And again, that's a function of Will Howard hasn't been asked to do much. I think I think it was Bill Connolly. He tweeted it out, and in the graphic, it was talking about offensive efficiency when the game probability, like ESPN's game probability, had the win percent between 10 and 90%. And what I took away from this graphic is Ohio State's offense has only run 13 snaps this year when the win probability was between 10 and 90%, which is essentially saying that they have had no game pressure at all this season, which through 5 games is insane. Just insane how dominant they've been. And I get, again, they haven't played anyone, but on the road, I think you got to give the edge to the home quarterback in this one.
Sure. I definitely can't disagree with that. I do think, looking at this, you were saying they're both coming from big time situations where they've had to play big games. I do think that's going to help both of them in this spot, right? You talked about the Red River shootout and being able to talk about that. I also would look, again, a couple years back, you can talk about the Big 12 championship game and Will Howard and him having to kind of lead some big time drives down the stretch there. And loving what both of these quarterbacks do. I love talking about those. So when we get to this, Ohio State right now, 3-point favorite. And I guess what do we have on the over-under? Over-under 53.5 right now. You don't necessarily need to pick the total on this one, but looking for a score, looking for a projection here. What are we thinking? How do you think this one plays out?
Well, I'm smashing the under. I just absolutely going to smash the under. Sweet. I think it's going to be kind of one of those feel it out type games early. First big game of the year, really first game with a pulse. I mean, no disrespect to Boise or Iowa, but first time that you're really playing someone who can punch back this year. I think there's going to be a little bit of feeling it out early. I think both teams are going to try to establish the run early in this one, but it's just based on what I've seen this year. It's really hard to pick against Ohio State right now. Just both sides of the ball. I mean, the defense is probably the best defense in the country. I think they can affect Dylan Gabriel a little bit more than Oregon's defense is going to be able to affect Will Howard. And I mean, we've seen Oregon's defense already get exploited by a quality running game once this year. Again, how much is that of that is the running back himself versus the overall scheme? But, you know, Ohio State's coming at you with two really talented guys. You know, I think Trey Henderson gets a little bit lost in the shuffle just because, you know, he's been hurt for a lot of his Ohio State career, but we're talking about a guy who was a 5-star coming out of college. So he certainly has the talent. If he could stay healthy, he probably wouldn't be on this roster right now. He'd probably be in the NFL. And then obviously Quinshon Judkins' resume speaks for itself. And, you know, you touched on the freshness factor. You know, I think both of them are averaging like 10, 11 yards per yards or 10 or 11 carries per game this year.
Right.
So they're not getting used. They should be plenty fresh for this game. I think there's just too many weapons on both sides of the ball for Ohio State. I think it'll be close. I am not confident in a cover, probably something, you know, like a 28-24, 27-24 in that range.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. When I wrote this down, I have Ohio State winning 28-24 right now. I think end of the day, you know, a lot of this is just an even matchup. A lot of this comes down to being, you know, good versus good. You know, you don't really find a whole lot of difference makers. For me, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, the difference is for me in the wide receiver cores. I just trust Ohio State's wide receivers to make plays on those 50-50 balls a little bit more than I trust Oregon's wide receivers. And look, Oregon has the talent at wide receiver to show up and you know, do it in this game. You just got to show me before I can actually believe that I'm going to see it on the field. And until I see it, I just can't really believe it from Oregon. So give me Ohio State as well. We're both on the Buckeyes to win this one.
Gracious, how about